In this article on my website, we compare the total cost of ownership of running ClickHouse Cloud versus an open source cluster on AWS. Now, this decision isn't as simple as it might first seem, because although open source is free to download and use, there are obviously costs associated with doing that, such as the infrastructure costs of your kind of AWS or Azure servers, and also the operational costs and the engineering time for setting it up and running it. There's also some kind of hidden costs, more subjective costs around risk and time to market of using a open source solution, although I don't dwell on those because they're a little bit more subjective. In this article I talk about three customer situations, and I wanted to spend some time just kind of modelling them out in a calculator that we have developed just to kind of bring those deltas to life. So in the first instance, I've modelled two relatively sizable environments. The first is a ClickHouse Cloud, and we have development, test and prod environment, a few nodes in each, so 10 in total. And in open source, we have the same setup, basically. And we can see that when we compare ClickHouse Cloud to the AWS environment, ClickHouse Cloud is more expensive. But this isn't really an apples to apples comparison, because here you're buying a fully managed product and solution, whereas here this is just for AWS infrastructure costs. But let's run with this for now. Now, the first customer I talk about, basically they have a variable workload, and that will play well to ClickHouse Cloud strengths because it can scale up and down easily in response to user demand. So if we model that out quickly, so if you say their development environment, maybe it's used during business hours, and turn it off here when people go for lunch. The test environment, so turn it off, and then we'll say on during business hours, and then I'll say the same, just modeling the fact that the workload is variable, and at points during the day we can scale to 0. And then maybe in the production environment, again it's probably used like relatively lightly, so we'll turn it all off. But basically people log in to access their reports in the morning when they first arrive, then in the evening when they before they leave for the day, and maybe occasionally somebody logs in to pull a report. So at that point we've kind of modelled the fact that ClickHouse Cloud is better able to adjust to the changing workload, and we're already at a point where the monthly cost is lower than our AWS costs. Now obviously we can do a little bit of automation in a cloud environment such as AWS or Azure. I can turn environments off overnight and over weekends and things like that. But if I want to adapt to a very variable workload by scaling up and down intraday, then that can be quite complex, and I'm going to need engineering time to do that. So hopefully that makes the point that, you know, ClickHouse Cloud's better auto scaling can kind of take cost out of this side of the equation, but it's obviously going to depend on your specific workload. The second situation I talk about in the article is the engineering tasks which are associated with running an open source environment, most of which are avoided if you used a managed service. So in this calculator I can model activities such as, you know, the initial setup, the ongoing maintenance, version upgrades, kind of network changes, operating system changes, managing your disk space, all of that type of stuff. If I begin with a kind of very conservative estimate that, you know, we're going to spend an hour to set all of that stuff up, and then 1 hour per month on some of those activities. So I'm really trying to be conservative here. And we're also plugging in a very reasonable kind of hourly rate for your engineering costs. I'm going to remove these temporarily. If we then go to our cost analysis, we can see that the open source cluster is becoming kind of significantly more expensive. So $30,000 versus 12. And if I project that out over 3 years, then the TCO of open source becomes kind of, the delta grows effectively. And this is all because of the operational effort associated with open source. If we are slightly more realistic here, so imagine in an enterprise you have different teams, they're interfacing with each other, you're working with compliance or asking how you're remaining secure, you're raising tickets to your networking team, you're having to do change control meetings to get more disk space and that type of stuff. So everything's just slower, there's more people involved. I think there's a lot of companies in that situation. So what I've done there is bumped that up to 5 hours per month for most of the activities. Still probably less than 1 full-time employee. So I still think I'm being conservative with that estimate. At that point, the cost of the open source cluster really begins to balloon as a result of the it's all the engineering time effectively. So this is that kind of second customer where they're operating in this environment where you just need a lot of people and a lot of time to manage your open source cluster. The third customer I talk about is someone who is very exposed to risk. So if they have any downtime, their customers could kind of move quite quickly. Imagine a trading business and they could migrate their trading flow to a competitor. Or if they have a more serious incident, they could have fines or regulatory penalties and things like that. Now, I get more nervous about these because they are more subjective, and you can tell any story you like by bringing subjective elements into a TCO calculator. But if I even begin to model these, so if I say extended downtime, the potential impact to your business, let's say $100,000, which is probably realistic for say a business in financial services if they're down all day. And if I say there's a 1% chance of that happening, I'm going to add that in as a risk factor. That can also be rolled in to the monthly cost. We can see that we've accounted $12,000 of risk for that. Bump it up to 3 years and the delta grows even further. Plug in a more aggressive situation, such as a data breach on an incorrectly configured open source cluster. You're going to have a $1 million fine, and again 1%, maybe too high, but at that point we can attribute a $10,000 cost per month. And here the numbers are just diverging enormously, and I think that is with quite quite reasonable assumptions. We're not inflating the manpower cost. We are maybe overinflating these risk factors a little bit. We've quite accurately modeled the ability to auto scale. And even if we argue about any of these specific numbers, we have enormously diverged across the total cost of the two solutions. So hopefully that makes a point that using a managed service can certainly be significantly cheaper than going down the self-managed route.